Welcome to the Veritas podcast, the weekly show where we study and discuss papal writings of the Catholic Church.
Hello, welcome to the Veritas podcast. Robert Sisko is my co-host. My name is Robert Kessman, and this is the podcast where we look at an encyclical and study it a couple paragraphs at a time. Previously, we discussed paragraph 11, and in that Pius talks about how modernists use feelings as a main source of their action. And the difference between modernists and Catholics are that modernists have an emotion or a feeling, and then they apply knowledge to it retroactively. So they feel something and then try to explain it away, and that's the wrong order to do things. Pius also discussed the intellect. The intellect searches for truth and knowledge, and this is obviously part of the discussion with the will. The will desires and chooses good, and you need to have both of those. A lot of the time, modernists only have the will, so they choose what feels good, and they ignore the intellect, which is seeking truth. They ignore truth, and that's a big problem nowadays where people don't want to hear truth about homosexuality, about an unborn baby, or whatever the case may be. So in this episode, we're going to cover paragraph 12. We're going to look at that. So let's go on and get started, Rob. In paragraph 12, Pope Pius writes, quote, "We have thus reached one of the principal points in the modernist system, namely the origin and the nature of dogma. For they place the origin of dogma in those primitive and simple formulas which, under a certain aspect, are necessary to faith. For revelation, to be truly such, requires the clear knowledge of God in the consciousness. But dogma itself, they apparently hold, strictly consists in the secondary formulas." End of quote. When Pius writes formulas, he's referring to interpretations. Pius earlier explained that modernists are constantly reinterpreting their expressions in their earlier interpretations, and how this leads to what they call dogma. Modernists constantly reinterpret everything, depending on how it fits for the time and the culture and society. So Sodom and Gomorrah is reinterpreted to be something else than what it is. Jesus walking on water, I even read one time where it was reinterpreted to be an LSD trip on drugs. Crazy stuff like that. But the modernists have to reinterpret dogma to fit their behavior in society. Rob?
Yeah, I want to start by reading part of chapter 11. I'm going to skip around here. I highlighted some parts of this that I think if I read these sentences, again, I'm jumping around a little bit, it'll kind of make it understandable. So I'm going to try that. He says this, quote, "God presents himself to man, but in a manner so confused and indistinct that he can hardly be perceived by the believer." Okay? "It is therefore necessary that a certain light should be cast upon this sense," this interior sense. "This is a task of the intellect, whose office it is to reflect and to analyze." Skipping down. "The mind then, encountering this sense," there's that word, encountering. "The mind then, encountering this sense, throws itself upon it." Okay, so the mind throws itself upon this encounter, this sense. Okay, continuing. "The operation of the mind in this work is a double one. First, by a natural and spontaneous act, it expresses its concept in a simple, popular statement. Then, on reflection and deeper consideration, or, as they say, by elaborating the thought, it expresses the idea in secondary propositions, which are more distinct and precise than the first." And then he says, "These secondary propositions, when they get the stamp of approval of the magisterium, become dogmas." So, to restate what he's saying here, he's saying that dogma, it originates within man as a feeling or a sense of the heart. Okay? It starts there. Then, this interior feeling, it results in man's consciousness becoming aware of something. Next, now the intellect gets involved. Next, the intellect is used to formulate a way to articulate what the person has become aware of. And again, the awareness comes from the heart, the sense, then it's an awareness. Then the intellect formulates and articulates what it is the person became aware of. Okay? And then Pius X said they refer to the first expression, the first articulation, as the, quote, primitive and simple formula. Okay, that's first. Next, the person, he is able to more clearly articulate what it is he originally perceived in his heart. Then he articulates it more clearly. This is called the secondary formula. The secondary formula eventually gets the approval of the magisterium and becomes a dogma. So notice, they believe that dogma has its source within man. It's simply man articulating what he feels inside within himself. So for a modernist, the teachings of the church, the doctrines and dogmas of the church are really just something that man projects outside of himself, okay? Now, in reality, as we know, the truths of the faith have been revealed by God external to man and passed down from the apostles, from generation to generation to generation to us. Now, we mentioned how the modernist system does have grains of truth in it. And there's a small grain of truth in what we just described. The grain of truth is that, yes, the church does formulate dogmas. And as we'll see later, it's true to say that there's greater clarity maybe in the way things are formulated. There can be greater clarity over time in the way things are formulated, but these dogmatic truths, they did not originate from man. And the greater clarity is never going to never be at variance with what is believed before. It'll just be more clearly understanding of what has always been believed. But the fundamental error there, the main error, is that modernists say, well, it just starts within man. You see, man has this feeling within him. Man becomes aware of something, and then man articulates what it is he became aware of. In reality, truth revealed by God externally, passed down to us. Yes, it's true the church does articulate these truths and formulate the dogma, but they're not formulating something that came from within man. They're formulating the truths that God has revealed that have been passed down to us from the time of the apostles.
And for modernists, it's the truth that fits them. It's their truth. And that's what's really important as well. So, okay, Pius continues in number 12, quote, "To ascertain the nature of dogma, we must first find the relation which exists between the religious formulas and the religious sense. This will be readily perceived by anyone who holds that these formulas have no other purpose than to furnish the believer with a means of giving to himself an account of his faith. These formulas, therefore, stand midway between the believer and his faith. In their relation to the faith, they are the inadequate expression of its object, and are usually called symbols. In their relation to the believer, they are mere instruments." End of quote. From one of the really good books that I like, Feeding the Lord's Flock, it's kind of a commentary on this encyclical. The writer says, quote, "In the mind of the modernists, these formulas, or interpretations, therefore unite the believer to his faith. But in reality, when it comes to the matter of faith, his interpretations of his own religious feelings are inadequate expressions about the object of his faith. He cannot define an objective view of faith in reality. All he can say is that he has a religious feeling." End of quote. Modernists base their entire system on this wishy-washy idea of emotions and feelings. Therefore, in the end, there is no objective basis for anything.
Right. Yep. Yeah, since everything comes from within man, there is no objective truth. There's really even no objective order. This comes from these modern philosophies. There's modern philosophies now that actually go so far as to deny the existence of any objective reality. They would deny that anything exists outside of our mind, that things only exist within our mind. I've got a friend who he reads some of this crazy stuff, and we'll get in discussions from time to time, and he was describing this to me. I think he was kind of falling for it. So what I told him is this. I said, all right, If you believe that everything only exists in your mind, you think you're seeing something, but in reality it only exists in your mind. I said, do this. I said, go stand in front of a brick wall, take off your shoe and sock, close your eyes, and kick as hard as you can forward. And then tell me if that wall only existed in your mind. But what I'm getting at is this modern philosophy now, it not only claims that truth comes from within us, but it's gone so far now that it even denies that anything exists outside of us. There is any external reality that exists outside of us. That's how far it's gone. Actually, that philosophy originated, I think, a little before modernism came about, so that probably had a lot to do with the development. Another thing to point out is that what I've noticed in studying these errors is how they're all interrelated. If you look at the errors for the last 300 years, they're interrelated. The philosophy, people from all different parts of the world, these errors are so interrelated, they could not have come from a human mind. They're too interrelated. They had to come from an intelligence. It was the devil. They had to come from the mind of the intellect is powerful as the devil, to be so interrelated, so unified. You can really see the diabolical source of these errors the more you study them in depth and kind of get an idea of what the source of these errors is. And modernism is another manifestation of these same modern errors. We in our earlier encyclical, Veritas, I think in this one also, I described how naturalism leads to rationalism logically, and then it leads to liberalism, and then it even leads to modernism. So they're all interconnected.
This is kind of a worldview too, Rob, or a philosophy is what we keep on talking about it. But you see this all the time. People don't really know this, and I keep on pounding this point home in all these encyclicals. They don't really realize how modernist they are and how it is through everything in society. You see this in bumper stickers, perception is reality, make your own truth, life is how you perceive it, and all that total garbage. But for most of these people, they don't know what they're talking about. They're less harmful than those who do know what they're talking about and really push this agenda, because it's not accidental. They want to be able to say that that perception is reality, you can make your own truth, because they don't like the truth. They don't like the truth, God, Jesus, so they have to formulate their own truths for whatever fits for them.
It's diabolical. It's all diabolical. Like you mentioned, the bumper sticker, perception is reality. People read these little sayings, and then they start to actually think this way. Gradually, from hearing this and absorbing it, you then start to think that way. And if you start to think that way, it's going to be really hard then to accept the truth when it's presented to you. So these modern philosophical errors, they destroy the intellect. They destroy the mind. That's why modern man can't think, because his mind has been shot by absorbing all these modern errors.
This actually kind of is related to a certain extent to this Eastern religion love fest that Westerners have had recently, centering, becoming one with yourself. I mean, who even knows what that stuff means, one with yourself? But for them, they think it's great. They don't even know what it means, because that would involve truth. They just like the experience of it. They just like having, as opposed to having something. Yeah. Well, let's get back to the encyclical, to where truth actually exists. Pius continues, quote, "Hence it is quite impossible to maintain that they absolutely contain the truth, for insofar as they are symbols, they are the images of truth, and so must be adapted to the religious sense in its relation to man. And as instruments, they are the vehicles of truth, and must therefore in their turn be adapted to man in his relation to the religious sense. But the object of the religious sense, as something contained in the absolute, possesses an infinite variety of aspects, of which now one, now another, may present itself. In like manner, he who believes can avail himself of varying conditions. Consequently, The formulas which we call dogma must be subject to these vicissitudes and are, therefore, liable to change. Thus, the way is open to the intrinsic evolution of dogma. Here, we have an immense structure of sophisms which ruin and wreck all religion. End of quote. Pius is speaking the truth, and he's explaining how modernists think. Modernists know and admit that their system is open to interpretation. That's what they like about it. They despise any objective truth, as we've said over and over again. They want the natural freedom to change their minds at any given time. Modernists, though, I think, Rob, are slothful. They don't want to be held to any standard and have to stick to it. They're like children who beg their parents to play the piano, but then give up after 2 lessons when it gets too difficult. They want to be able to say, well, at this point in my life, I no longer believe in the piano, or in God, let's say. I no longer believe that the piano is right for me. And this is also where you see a lot of this disorders and the sickness with sexual orientation, supposedly. Well, that time in my life I was experimenting. Or you hear that with drugs. And that's just an excuse for their deviant behavior. Rob, what do you think?
They do the same exact thing with Catholic dogma. They'll say, because, again, for them, dogma is just something that we express, comes out of us. That's where dogma comes. So they'll say, and of course, then also dogma will need to be changed and updated as we begin to feel a little different. We feel different today about things, so we need to update our teaching to correspond with our new feelings. So they'll say, yeah, Catholics used to believe that the Eucharist is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ, but that was just a way to satisfy their inner need. You know, they wanted to believe that that was Christ, and so they made that a dogma. Today, we don't believe that anymore. Or Catholics used to believe there was no salvation outside the Catholic Church, but we don't believe that anymore either. They'll reject dogmas. They'll reject truths revealed by God and defined by the Church because they'll think those truths weren't revealed by God. They came from man, and they can change. They can evolve. They can evolve to keep up with man's new consciousness. So a person believes that dogmas are just an expression of an inner feeling. When the feeling changes, so too will the dogmas change. So modernism is a house built on sand. It's built on the sand of emotions and feelings. And no wonder then that the church today, which is infested with modernism, is in the process of basically collapsing. Now, it's not going to be destroyed. Christ said the gates of hell will not prevail, and that's true. But he didn't say the gates of hell are going to make a whole lot of progress and just about destroy the church, which is what's happening. He just does not going to prevail completely. So it is going to collapse. This collapse is happening right now. But when the collapse is finished, those who continue to adhere to the true faith, they're going to be the ones that are left standing, and then they're going to be the ones that are then left to rebuild the ruined church that was destroyed by the modernists.
Yeah, Rob, you see all the time some of the faithful will say, well, the church doesn't teach that anymore, or we've moved past that, or that's when the church was in the dark ages, and now the church is woken up. You see it all the time on message boards and on the internet. What's unique about the internet now is you can read an article and then you can see the comments down below, and if it has anything to do with the kind of church, especially Pope Francis nowadays, it's kind of not really a scientific study, but it's a snapshot on what the everyday faithful believes. And you'll see somebody identify themselves as Catholic and say, I was never taught that, or thank the Lord that the church no longer teaches birth controls, or that homosexuality is a sin, or limbo, that sort of thing. But Rob, let me ask you this. I think it's much worse than that. I think that there's some in the hierarchy that also believe not necessarily the church no longer teaches that, but that they don't want the church to teach certain things anymore, and that it's not in the best interest.
Yeah, actually, I think what you're thinking of is something that Cardinal Ratzinger wrote in 1990. Let me read here this I believe you're referring to. He said, quote, the text, he's referring to the document Instruction on the Theological Ecclesial Vocation. The text also presents the various types of bonds that arise from the different degrees of magisterial teaching. It affirms perhaps for the first time with its clarity, that there are decisions of the magisterium that cannot be the last word on the matters as such, but are, in a substantial fixation of the problem, above all, an expression of pastoral prudence, a kind of provisional disposition. The nucleus remains valid, but the particulars, which are the circumstances of the times influenced, may need further correction. So what he just said right here is that there's certain things that magisterium has said that, they're not the last word. Maybe they're not the last word on the matter. Maybe there can be changes in that, okay? Now he's going to give some examples of what he's talking about. In this regard, one may think of the declarations of the popes in the last century, the 19th century, about religious liberty, as well as the anti-modernist decisions at the beginning of this century. Above all, the decision of the Biblical Commission of the time. As a cry of alarm in the face of hasty and superficial adaptations, they will remain fully justified. A person such as John Baptiste Metz said, for example, that the Church's anti-modernist decision rendered a great service of preserving her from falling into the liberal bourgeois world. But in the details of the determination they contain, they become obsolete after having fulfilled their pastoral mission at their proper time, unquote. So he's saying that this encyclical, for example, on Pascendi, where it's condemning these modernist heresies, it's just a pastoral, prudential decision of the magisterium. But today, doesn't really apply anymore. All the encyclicals of the popes of the 19th century and first half of the 20th century condemning religious liberty as a heresy, doesn't apply anymore. That was good then, but it's not good anymore. It doesn't really apply today. Here's something else that he said. Quote, the identity of the Christian substance as such, the Christian thing, was not directly censured, but it was pointed out that no formula, no matter how valid and indispensable it may have been in its time, can fully express the thought mentioned in it and declare it unequivocally forever, since language is constantly in movement and the contents of its meaning changes. So unquote. So he's saying here that the dogmatic formulas, he's saying the same thing that Pius X said about the modernists, that dogmatic formulas do not contain immutable truth. They're merely expressions of the truth that need to be changed and adapted as man progresses on. That's the same thing that Ratzinger said right here, that no formula, quote, no formula, no matter how valid and indispensable it may have been in its time, in its day, can fully express the thought mentioned in it. The same thing that Pius X condemned in Pascendi. So here we see members of the magisterium, Cardinal Ratzinger at the time, 1990, basically saying the same thing that Pius X accuses the modernists of.
And what we're saying is, Rob and I cannot say this person or this bishop or this pope is a heretic or whatever, but we can objectively judge their words and their writing. We don't know what's in their soul, obviously, but why else is Pius's words available to us but to use of our own intellect? One final thing to show, I think, really how dire the situation is, and it's not the laity so much, it's those who are supposed to be the shepherds of this flock. Ratzinger in 1998, in his book, Many Religions, One Covenant, and that should already be enough, says the following, quote, I shall learn my own truth better if I understand the other person and allow myself to be moved along the road to the God who is ever greater, certain that I never hold the whole truth about God in my own hands. And that's a direct quote.
Now, it's true, we don't have the whole truth of God, but we have the whole truth that He's revealed. We have everything that God's revealed about Himself is taught by the Church. So the Catholic Church teaches the entire revelation of God. I mean, there may be things about God that we don't know, but we know all that He's revealed. So you can't search through other false religions and learn anything more than what is taught by the Church, because the Church has the entire complete revelation.
Right, because in the context of this discussion, he's talking about talking to people from other religions and other churches, and he's insinuated that he can get truth from these non-Catholic religions. And that sounds a lot like this dogmatic evolution that St. Pius has been warning us about. So if that is what we're hearing from popes, he was a cardinal at the time, then is it any wonder that the everyday Catholic in the pew who comes to Mass, as we talked about before, maybe once a month, is confused at best? But as I said before, I don't think they're even confused. I think they're pretty certain in their error. So that's why I think writings like Pope Pius's and Leo XIII's Libertas as well are even more important now than they were when they were written, because the error is so all-encompassing.
Yeah. It's like we've mentioned before, these are the lights that will guide us through these errors. So fortunately, God permitted this to take place during the information age. So we have access to all this information. We have the Internet. We can find all the encyclicals, all the old catechisms. So anything before 1960, you're on safe ground. You'll get the truth. Anything after 1960 should be suspect. So just stick with the old stuff. You'll be on safe ground. And as you read the truth, read the books of the saints, the writings of the popes, you get a good sense of right and wrong. You can then perceive. You get the sensus catholicus, so you can then kind of spot an error, even if you're not exactly sure how it's wrong. By sticking with the good stuff, you can then spot the errors almost just by instinct. It's like people who work at a bank who are taught to look for counterfeit money. They're first given only good money, only the genuine money. They get the feel for it. They know how it feels. Then they throw in a fake one, and they can tell. They can tell it's not the genuine thing. They may not exactly know what kind of paper it's on, or they just can tell it's not real. So if you stick with just the good stuff, read only the good stuff, you'll have a sense. You'll be able to tell when you're dealing with some modernist garbage just by almost instinct. Your Catholic sense will be able to pick up on that, because you'll have the reason is because your intellect will be informed with the truth. It'll be solidly informed with the truth. So when an error crops up, it's just not going to seem right. And the opposite is true also. When you've embraced all these errors, the truth's probably not going to seem right. So stick with the good stuff before 1960. You'll be on safe ground. That's what to do in this day to keep from falling into error. And then, of course, reading these old encyclicals.
Good advice. Let's close out with that. Everybody, join us next time. We hope to go to paragraph 13 in Pascendi. Take care.